being recorded.
Good morning / good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're at. We'll give it just one more minute here to make sure that the waiting room clears out as people are being added to the meeting.
That was quick.
We encourage everyone to put their Zoom thingy on mute during the presentation. We'll be, if you've got questions as we go, we encourage you to use the chat box. And then, of course, at the end of the presentation, if you'd like to have a discussion, we'll invite you to unmute your speakers at that point for a little conversation. Appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to join us for this. This is the latest in our series of NCTA webinars. I'm both your host and your presenter today, so lucky you. On our topic of coal and politics, two things you're not supposed to discuss at dinner table, but we've got this here midterm elections thing coming up in a couple of months, and the ramifications are pretty serious for our industry. So we thought it would be a good idea to check in now and take the temperature of where we think things are going on the midterm election front. Just quickly, a brief word from our sponsor. Want to let you know we've got a number of non-members joining us today, so I wanted to quickly remind everybody that the National Coal Transportation Association programming supports shippers of coal and other large bulk commodities through both advocacy and information sharing. We have a utility on-time performance survey that's in the field now that has been extremely useful in discussions with the U.S. Surface Transportation Board and other transportation policy officials on the federal level. We have a very active operations and maintenance committee that's been investigating the impact of longer train sets, as well as covering a host of O&M issues that help owners of rail cars get more out of their investments. Our next issue of the Transporter magazine, advertising is still available, and it also will be featuring a buyer's guide. And the content of the Transporter magazine this time will be focused on rail in the digital age, both in terms of freight rail car monitoring and the outlook for automation and rail controls. And then finally, we have a bi-weekly newsletter, the On Track. If you're not on that list, let us know. We'd love to put you on there. It contains a ton of information on current events in the transportation sector, including some critical rail labor issues that are going on now. We may be staring down the throat of a potential national rail strike around the middle of September, and we are providing a lot of information now and tracking on that dynamic situation as it's developing. Also in September, you have an opportunity to join us at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver, Colorado for our 48th annual business meeting and conference. We've got a couple of very exciting keynote speakers, a former director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, a current member of the Surface Transportation Board, and Philip Kuntz, who's a former Navy SEAL and inspirational speaker on dealing with adversity and planning for the unknown. I think it's a presentation that will be memorable for everybody. And finally, we encourage those non-members on the call here today to support us and support these activities by becoming a member. NCTA membership is one of the most economical opportunities in the industry. Only $1,700 to $1,900 a year, and we encourage you to join and support the activities that we've got underway. So with the shameless self-promotion out of the way, again, I'll reiterate a plea to please keep your microphones on mute as we walk through the presentation, and make liberal use of the chat box if you have questions as we move along here. I've always felt like presentations like this one should have warning labels. So I came up with one for this. Number one, any opinions that sneak into this presentation are mine, and not necessarily those of NCTA or its members. I'll caution you that discussions about politics may induce nausea or other feelings of discomfort in some patients. And I'll point out two things about news media and pundits, and that is, number one, it's always easiest for the news media to beat up on whoever's in power. And number two, that horse races make for better reading and watching than blowouts. And you'll see as we get into it right now that there are some indications that what was looking like a blowout in this election is starting to look a little more like a horse race, but you may have to take that with a grain of salt. Remembering phone numbers and losing the ability to navigate opinion polling has become increasingly unreliable since the proliferation of cell phones and people losing their home phones and caller ID being able to screen out pollsters and things like that. A lot of the data we'll be talking about here is based on polling data. So once again, grain of salt. And then finally in boldface, and I'm encountering this in every phase of life right now, it's the principle I call, when since the pandemic has anything worked the way it is supposed to? And so a lot of interpretation here based on historical trends, but what do they say in the financial world? Previous results are no guarantee of future success. So with that, let's dive in to what's expected from this midterm election. Clarence Darrow said history repeats itself, and that's one of the things that's wrong with history. But there are some very clear trends that can give us an idea of where things are likely to head. And one of them is that, the new baseline for politics in the United States is change. Since 1992, there have only been 3 elections that have not resulted in a change in control of the House, the Senate, or the White House, or multiples of those. So, over the last, just going back to 2000, only in 2004 and 2012 did you see elections that did not have some change. So that argues for the fact that we're probably going to see some change right now. A Democrat-controlled House by one of the narrowest majorities in history, a Senate that is democratically controlled, but on a vote basis is a 50-50 division between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, which means the vice president is frequently called in to break the ties. And then, of course, a Democrat in the White House. The big question for the midterms is, can the Democrats hang on to those slim majorities in all 3 chambers of government? One-party control is really hard to maintain. Again, looking at history, there have only been 2 times since 1971 that one party has been able to control both houses of Congress and the White House for more than 2 years, or more than 2 elections for more than 2 years. And the Democrats are on their 2nd year now. So again, a headwind for Democrats going into this midterm season. People are wanting change on a regular basis, and all of the leading indicators right now are suggesting a GOP wave. This is a really interesting compilation of the main attributes that run into when people vote for change. And 2022 is right at the top for all of them. Consumer sentiment is lower than it has been in years. The number of people who are dissatisfied with the way the country is going is at its highest. Inflation is at its highest. The president's job approval is bouncing back and forth between the lowest, either the first lowest or second lowest, and trust in Congress is also at an all-time low. So all of these are indicators that some big changes in the midterm elections may be on the way. And it's also worth noting that the Republicans tend to hold the advantage on what are the hottest issues. This is a pretty busy chart, but when you ask which political party do you trust to do a better job of handling different issues, Democrats come out on top with issues like abortion, climate change, and the pandemic. But on issues that tend to matter more to voters: crime, inflation, gas prices, the economy. The Republicans, which is the bottom of the chart on the right, the Republicans tend to come out on top. And so in a we can debate it now whether we're entering a recession or not, but clearly people are dissatisfied. The issues that rise to the top are the bread and butter issues more than the social issues, and that works in the Republicans' favor. This is another way of looking. I guess I didn't reduce that in time, but this is another way of looking at that same issue of what's most important to voters. Now, the economy has been the most important issue concerning Americans now for 49 weeks running. And that runs across both Democrat and Republican voters. That left column there, the all, suggests that crime is the second one. And then the environment, where the Democrats are most important, second most important to Democrats, is far less important to Republicans. So you can kind of go down and look at that list. But again, the Republicans tend to come out on top on the issues that are important to certainly their voters, but also to all voters when you look at them in the aggregate. And one of the most interesting things that I've seen come out recently is how what one political analyst I trust very much in Washington, D.C., Bruce Melman, has coined as the woke lash, which is a backlash against some of the woke policies and that are being produced out there, are showing some really interesting changes. So if you look at the issue of who do you trust to do a better job on education, Democrats have scored better than Republicans, forever, for as long as there's been data out there. But that has flipped this year, and this is not Republican data here either. This is Democrats for education reform, but the trust gap on education has now flipped to Republicans, and notably in that bottom right-hand corner note there that among all voters, Republicans are favored by a 4% share. Among parents who actually have kids in school, that number moves up to 9%. And really curiously, to voters of color, it moves up to 10%. So some of the constituencies, such as voters of color that have been traditional mainstays for Democratic voters, are now shifting on issues like education, where some of the woke politics of the current era are starting to interfere with, again, bread and butter issues of where's my kid going to go to school and what are they going to teach him when he gets there. So all of that is scrambling lines, and keep in mind that President Biden, this is a midterm election. It's just the House and Senate. But keep in mind that President Biden is on the ballot, even though the White House is not on the ballot. And the perceptions of President Biden and his administration are, frankly, a further headwind for the Democrats that are running for re-election in Congress. Overall, the president has been perceived as being soft on immigration policies, softer and effective on inflation policies, soft on crime. The defund the police movements of a couple of years ago have now come back to bite in many traditional Democratic districts. And that bottom corner there, soft on foreign policy, that's probably moderated a little bit since the Ukraine war. But as we'll see in a minute, when we look at the president's approval ratings, the decline, the sharp decline in the president's approval ratings really began last summer with the pullout from Afghanistan and how that was handled. So these are the favorability ratings for President Biden from the beginning of his term until literally yesterday. And you can see that that crossover point, the the red or orange line there is what percent disapprove of the job he's doing, and the green line is what percent approve. And that crossover point was really last summer, around the time of the Afghanistan pullout, and around the time that inflation concerns started to set in. Now, if you look at the tail end of that graph, though, there has been some improvement in the president's approval ratings. As of today, those approval ratings are higher than they've been since April. There was another tick up. I think there was an article in the Hill this morning that says he just ticked up over the 41% approval rating. But still, that's it hasn't been good. It hasn't been great basically since he took office, and those presidential approval numbers are not particularly encouraging if you're a House Democrat running for re-election right now. And in fact, in some swing districts, we're seeing some House Democrats doing advertising that attempts to distance themselves from the president. So as the election season gets going here, get ready to be exposed to approximately 1.2 zillion negative ads. With little doubt, 2022 is going to be the most expensive midterm election in U.S. history. When you look at the advertising that's out there, the Republicans will be jumping on themes about the Biden administration's management of the economy, foreign failures in Afghanistan and so forth, the border and crime. COVID and the reaction to it is still hanging around as a political issue, and then of course the woke lash, which is getting traction for Republicans in constituencies outside of their traditional constituencies. On the Democratic side, you'll see their messaging focusing on Republicans being, quote unquote, too dangerous. The Supreme Court's recent abortion decisions will be making it into a lot of advertising. Vaccinations, gun control, climate issues, and then of course, the continuing influence of former President Trump on the Republican Party will all be first and foremost in the Democratic messaging that goes out. This election spending is just mind-boggling. Just so you can know, we're looking at almost $2 billion. That's right, billion with a B. Almost $2 billion will be spent on advertising in the House, close to $2.5 billion in the Senate, close to $2.5 billion in some governor races around the country. And then that $3 billion worth of spending in other is super PACs and others that are promoting issues that are not naming specific candidates, but are nevertheless are being, jockeyed to give political advantage to one party or the other. So it has become incredibly expensive, and some would say out of control. The sheer volume of information that will be going out, or has been going out, will continue to be going out as we inch closer to the November elections. So that's the what to expect set of things, and that's been kind of the paradigm for folks for over a year now. That the conventional wisdom was going to be that Democrats have enjoyed this brief period with very, very narrow majorities in the House and Senate, but that they're being set up for a shellacking at the midterms, and we'll see a wave of Republican takeovers in both. As renowned economist John Kenneth Galbraith was fond of saying, though, the enemy of conventional wisdom is not ideas, but the march of events. And there have been some events lately that have been giving pause to some politicians and some political analysts regarding the size of this Republican wave that everybody has been expecting. Few of the things that contribute to this moderation now. One thing is that the process of congressional redistricting ended up being a mixed bag. The Republicans performed very well in the last general election cycle in state house elections. As you know, the Republicans already dominated most state legislatures and most governor's offices. The last general election added to that, even though the Democrats won and came out with majorities at the federal level, they lost ground at the state level. And of course, it was those state legislatures that at the election after a census year redrew the congressional district maps. And of course, the predictions were all dire that they would be gerrymandered into a Republican-proof landscape out there. It didn't end up quite being that way. Actually, it was not the boom to the Republicans that were expected, despite their dominance, but states that there were some states that favored Democrats. Gerrymandering is not a one-way accusation. There was that kind of activity going on both the Democrat and the Republican side. And some of the ones that favored Democrats have been getting overturned in the courts as well, such as in Maryland and New York. So the impact of redistricting that was expected to be a major influence in favor of Republicans in this election cycle hasn't turned out to be as big of an advantage as some had predicted. The other thing that's working to the Democrats' favor now is that the Biden agenda has shown some success. If we fast forward 10 years or 20 years and put on a historian's hat and say, how were the first 2 years of the Biden administration? They've done a lot. Now, you may disagree on the impacts of what they've done, but they've succeeded in advancing a nearly $3.5 trillion, that's with a TR, not a B, a $3.5 trillion agenda. The American Recovery Act was about 1.9 trillion. The big infrastructure bill that passed last fall was $0.5 trillion. The CHIPS and Science Act that just passed this summer, another $280 billion. And then the Inflation Reduction Act that passed a couple of weeks ago that contains a whole bunch of climate provisions, but also some tax and healthcare provisions in there, is another 700 billion. So if you put that $3.5 trillion agenda in historical context, there was a lot accomplished in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. They also were able to expand NATO. There was a new gun safety law passed in the wake of some horrific shootings. They did succeed in passing a bill that addresses benefits for veterans exposed to burn pits. And so from even though the noise has been loud, from a legislative perspective, the Biden administration has been able to advance its agenda and will be able to campaign on those accomplishments. Other events that are scrambling the final months of this race include the Supreme Court's abortion decision, which has overturning Roe v. Wade, which has had the effect of energizing some segments of the Democrat base. Gas prices are starting to come down. They're still awful high, but they're not as high as they were a couple of months ago, and they're expected to continue to decline as we get a little closer to Election Day. Unemployment rates remain very low, although that's a little bit of a deceptive number because the labor pool is also shrinking. We'll see where this goes, but the last inflation report showed things leveling off, moderating a little bit. I put a big question mark there. We've got 2 more months of inflation reports coming before the election, but at least if you're a Democrat, it's not getting worse. And then finally, particularly on the Senate side of the equation, the Republicans, there's 5 very winnable Senate races for Republicans where the candidates have been struggling to raise money and get some traction. And so Senate races in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia are turning out to be a lot closer than a lot of people would have predicted 6 months ago or even a couple of months ago. So the races seem to be tightening. in certain sectors. You're also seeing the Democrats improve a little bit. The generic ballot is an interesting measurement where, you just ask people, are you more likely to vote for a Republican or a Democrat? Not speaking about any specific candidate or any specific race. And it's actually a fairly reliable indicator when taken in context with other things. And again, you'll see the Democrats were steadily declining on the generic ballot, with the Republicans taking the lead around the first of the year. But just last week, the Democrats inched back over the top of the Republicans on the generic ballot, which shows some momentum going in their direction. So the gets us to a point of saying, that a change in control is still likely. But how big is that change in control? I love this graph that was put together well over a year ago, predicting the GOP wave, reminding us that it takes only one seat to flip control of the Senate, and it takes only 5 seats to flip control of the House. But updated for today, that generic ballot last December had the Republicans up 3.1%. In April, they were up 3.6%. It was still going Republicans' way, but now they're back down to kind of even money. On the House side, the indicators are still strong. Another great indicator is, when people who are in the majority decide to retire, it's a pretty good signal that at least those people are reading the tea leaves, because it's no fun to go from being in the majority and chairing committees to going back to not having much power. There remain far more retirements from House Democrats than there were for Republicans. But 538, a well-respected, basically nonpartisan political analysis group. Right now, they've got the odds of the Republicans winning back control of the House at 77 in 100, compared to 36 in 100 as chances to win back the Senate. Take the wave is coming, but the wave looks a lot smaller today than it did a year ago or even 6 months ago. This is an eye chart, but the key thing you can tell from this is if you're looking at the House, the outlook for the House, the source of this is the Cook Political Report. This is obviously not all of the House races, but the ones that are considered competitive in any way. And Charlie Cook ranks them from likely D to likely R. And the key thing to show, so the key thing to look up there is the middle columns, the toss-up columns. So the left toss-up column is seats that are Democrat now but are solidly in play. The next gray column over is the toss-up seats that are in Republican hands now but are still solidly in play. You can see that there are a whole bunch more Democratic seats that are in that toss-up category than there are Republican seats in that toss-up category. And when you look over in the red columns there, you see some blue items there that indicate Democratic seats that are leaning or likely to flip to Republicans, where if you look at the blue columns on the left, there's a whole lot less Republican seats that are at serious risk of flipping to Democrats. So the House continues to look much stronger than the Senate in terms of which races are going to flip. And this slide deck will be available after. If you're a political junkie or you have aspirations to be one, you can look in on this and look at the actual candidates who have the biggest races on their hands. Similarly, in the Senate, and the source of this one is Real Clear Politics, which is another good nonpartisan source. You can see that there are basically 8 seats in that toss-up category. So if Republicans were to sweep all of them, they could come out with a 54, 55 seat majority, which allows you to get a lot closer to that 60 vote threshold that it takes to stop filibusters that can be used by the minority party to slow things down in the Senate. Conversely, the Democrats are going to have to hold on to more. So the Senate's still in play, but again, it's going to be a lot tighter over there. And if the Republicans do win back control, there's the real possibility that they may win back control with as thin a majority as the Democrats enjoy now, with maybe just 50 or 51 seats. That's important. It still allows you to set the agenda. It still allows you to control what gets talked about, but it's still well short of the 60 vote threshold that it takes for a party to do pretty much whatever they want. I didn't include a slide here, but this is a really important map. Again, in the House, everybody's up for election every 2 years. So it's like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. The minute this election's over, you start planning the next one. In the Senate, with senators serving 6 years, only a third of the body is up for election every 2 years. And if you look at this map for the next election, the general election that will be coming up in 2024, it's going to be even harder for the Democrats to defend. So if you're a Republican looking at this map, you're hoping that you can get to even that 50 or 51 or 52 vote seat majority this year, because in the next election cycle 2 years from now, there's going to be a real possibility that the Republicans will be able to expand their majority even further at that point. So those are the things that are moderating what's been seen as what has been regarded for a while as a wave election. But I wanted to throw some things out there that get to my last point on the warnings slide, which is what really works the way it's supposed to since the pandemic, but also since some other major cultural shifts that have been happening in our society, and that make it a little harder to depend solely on all that historical data we just worked through as to how things are supposed to happen in politics. So, my favorite Buffalo Springfield song there, something's happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. One of the things that's different now that we're still trying to figure out how this works is the effect of media. All right, we've gone from we've gone from the vision of the internet was that we'd have all of this information instantly available to us. Some of us are obnoxious at cocktail parties, when we're Googling, who sang this song and, who's alive and dead and, what year did that happen? We have all of this information instantly at our fingertips now, but instead of making it smarter, it's kind of had the opposite effect, because not only do we have more information available now, we also have more disinformation available now, and we're losing any kind of sense of shared reality in our society. Those of us on the call who are old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, and I'm not saying this is what we need to go back to or that this was a perfect system, but in the good old days, Walter Cronkite would come on every night at 5 o'clock and end the broadcast with, "That's the way it is," and everybody believed it, So, it was not great. There were, the newspapers had local monopolies. You had 3 main news networks. National newspapers and magazines probably had an outsized influence. But then that morphed with cable TV and talk radio. And then they added the addition of pundits and all the special interest sites, that you had a whole set of new gatekeepers that came in to play for a number of years and really diversified and kind of vibranted up the political discussion. But what we seem to be moving into now is that, there are no gatekeepers. I mean, I'm a guy who spends part of my life talking to reporters from news media. And in the old days, reporters were folks that, might have gone to journalism school or at least had some apprenticeship or standards or training or that sort of thing. Now I frequently do interviews with citizen reporters, people who are just writing for a blog or a podcast or something like that. And people are starting to get more and more of their information through Twitter and Facebook and other social media, where your sources of information are people you just pick to follow, or sources that the algorithm at the bottom of that program picked for you. And it's having some interesting effects on our society. The other thing that gerrymandering we talked about before, the redistricting of the congressional districts has really had an effect of killing competitive seats. There are far more seats that are considered swing seats in play. So not only is the information being used in the campaigns becoming polarized and bifurcated, the congressional districts are becoming a lot less competitive. And this polarization has become endemic in Congress. Now, this is an old chart, but I'm confident that the core of this has not changed. If you went back to like the 40s, this is a compilation of House member votes on different issues. The red dots representing Republicans, the blue dots representing Democrats. And you can see going back to the 40s, 50s, even 60s, there was a lot of overlap. You had folks who always voted Democrat, there were folks who always voted Republican, but then there were the issues where people, crossed lines and voted together. That all started to change as that media environment started to change. And it's reached a point now, and again, this was 2015, a graph in 2021, 2022 is going to look no different, possibly even worse. The parties have just completely split, and it's very rare when you see party members crossing lines, polarization being baked in. Here's another view of what's happened with polarization of our politics. This is the share of either Republicans or Democrats who have a very unfavorable view of the opposing party. And if you go back to 1994, you had your 17% of Democrats really didn't like Republicans and 21% of Republicans really didn't like Democrats. Look at what those numbers sit at today. Over half of Democrats have a very unfavorable view of the opposition, and over 60% of the Republicans have a very unfavorable view of the opposition. So this polarization is becoming endemic in our political society. And this is a really interesting article. I know The Atlantic tends toward a more liberal magazine, but this is actually an article that was very even-handed in review. And the headline, "Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid." And it's not just a phase. That illustration is, straight out of the Bible, the Tower of Babel. We've through all the effects of these changing medias and the over-reliance on social media, we've kind of forgotten how to talk to each other. If you're on one side of the political spectrum or the other, it's really easy, to blame President Trump for things that have happened in the last few years. But I kind of blame Mark Zuckerberg. I think it's the this polarization has been fed and augmented by the social media algorithms that are driving people farther and farther into their respecting rabbit holes, and the disinformation that can come along with that on both sides of the spectrum, that are preventing people from getting to realistic things. So what is that? We promised in the promotions here to say, what does all of this mean for coal and for energy? This is the photo that launched 1,000 write the caption contests. I'll let you write your own, but that's President Biden handing the pen to Joe Manchin on the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act a couple of weeks ago, which both sides will admit has almost nothing to do with inflation, but rather has that big package of climate provisions and also some healthcare provisions and a little bit of tax reform thrown in there for good measure. I'll tell you that, I was in a meeting with Senator Manchin just a few weeks before that with a whole bunch of other coal people, in which Senator Manchin was being lauded for his stalwart efforts to prevent previous legislation that was anti-coal, anti-fossil fuels, and those folks are not too happy with Senator Manchin now for having come up with the deal that he did. On the other hand, the environmentalists aren't entirely satisfied either, because the deal that Senator Manchin did come up with had things in there for carbon capture and storage and some pipelines, and extracted also at least a promise to look at permitting reforms, although that promise looks unlikely that it's going to be able to go anywhere from here. This is a sarcastic headline. Does anyone know my favorite Joan Didion novel? It's a novel called The Year of Magical Thinking. It's actually a book about grief, not about magical thinking. But I see scientific papers like this one, and this is an actual journal paper, and just read the headline for yourself. Zero air pollution and zero carbon from all energy at low cost and without blackouts in variable weather throughout the U.S. with 100% wind, water, solar, and storage. This political polarization has extended into the energy world now, where we have people on one side of the spectrum who think we can go cold turkey off of fossil fuels today, to some of us who are more toward the other side, who have opinions that, energy transitions may be worthwhile, but they take a while to get done. And this division has created a real self-imposed energy policy conundrum for the Biden administration, which has executive orders that prioritize climate and environmental justice action in every rulemaking, not just in energy, but in everything the administration does. They're instructed to prioritize climate and environmental justice. So you get situations like, well, we want more oil from Canada, but we don't want you to build a new pipeline to get it here. It's a really interesting political position to be in. Now, as far as it pertains to coal, everyone on this call is probably aware that coal prices throughout this year have been, setting record highs all the time. Does that mean that why? Well, we've got a global energy crisis. Not just in the United States. In the United States, coal plant closures are being delayed now. There have been at least 7 coal plant closure delays announced already, and I believe more are on the way to come. And globally, coal consumption continues to grow rapidly, especially in India and China, which are now the largest consumers of coal. And it comes to the inherent long-term nature of energy transitions. There's some really good books out there about how long it took the steam engine to catch on. I mean, how long it took coal to catch on over wood. Infrastructure is in place, and it takes a long time to get things changed out. So coal should be sitting pretty right now, right? Set for a comeback. Not exactly, because of what I call the 4 horsemen of the coal apocalypse. Number one, the U.S. coal capacity, the coal production capacity in the U.S. has been, we can do a whole other presentations on this. Actually, we did at the spring meeting. We can go into that in another setting if you'd like to. But U.S. coal production capacity has rationalized over the past few years. The decline in coal usage has led to production capacity falling out of the market. So you can't just turn it back on overnight. Supply chain bottlenecks have seriously limited the industry's ability to rebuild coal stockpiles that were depleted in 2021 because of record high natural gas prices and an unexpected cold winter. We are in the midst of a rail service meltdown that is being slow to recover. So those who have been trying to burn more coal or replenish their stockpiles have been experiencing difficulty doing that across the country. We've got persistently high natural gas prices that are contributing to higher coal utilization. But the big but there is that the longer term U.S. coal industry prospects are limiting incentives for capital investment. I mean, it's when the Secretary of Energy goes to the Aspen Institute and browbeats the oil industry and says, well, you need to increase production so that we can get these gas prices back down. And then the oil industry asks, well, are you still going to try to kill us next year? And the answer is, well, sure we are. The coal people are in a similar situation. Should we go out and invest millions and millions of dollars to ramp our capacity back up when there's still a federal government out there that's committed to shutting us down, and our customers are locked in on some commitments to phase themselves out of coal. So I mean, it's a good time for selling coal. There's good prices out there, and you can sell probably as much as you can get people to deliver for you. But in terms of long-term shifts in the market, it's not likely. So, I'm sorry, one of my favorite Far Side comics there, bummer of a birthmark, Hal. Coal remains a target in the U.S. and the grand conclusion for coal is that it's probably not what either side would like to see. Coal, folks with Friends of Coal stickers, on their cars and briefcases would love to see it come screaming back to where it used to be. That's not likely to happen. But, our friends with green socks who would like to see it eliminated tomorrow, that's not going to happen either. What is going to happen is that the Biden administration is ramping up its attacks on coal as well. And the EPA Secretary Michael Regan has said in multiple venues that variations of this quote: "We don't have to overly rely on any one rule. It's looking at the full suite of authorities to maximize our ability to protect communities and the public health." EPA has made no bones about the fact that they're going to continue to push whatever environmental regulation buttons are at their disposal to continue to create even more pressure to close coal plants down. Even this headline below: Biden preps full court press to curb coal as emissions spike. EPA is preparing to Supreme Court proof President Biden's ambitions for a carbon-free power grid. This administration, the decision that came out of the Supreme Court a month or two ago, overturning EPA's previous efforts to regulate carbon emissions outside the fence line of power plants and remake the economy through a carbon regulation. The Supreme Court overturned that, but this administration saw it coming. They knew that the two previous attempts by Democratic administrations to do this were not going to stand up in court. And so they have been pursuing Administrator Regan's vision of pulling every lever that's available to them. And so they're pulling levers like the coal combustion residuals rule. This one's back in court now because 2015, 7 years into the implementation of this rule, they've come back now with interpretations on individual coal combustion residuals disposal sites that are tougher than what's actually in the rule. Trying to drive to mandate closure by removal rather than closure in place, inflict more costs on the plants, get them to shut down faster, that sort of thing. Again, that's in litigation, but they're also looking at toughening the effluent limitation guidelines, toughening the mercury and air toxic standards. They promised to come out with another round of greenhouse gas regulations to avoid the previous court decision problems, regional haze, waters of the United States, national ambient air quality standards, and these efforts don't even include other regulations that this administration is pursuing that are targeting mining. So the regulatory assault will continue. So to wrap it up and leave a little bit of time for questions if there are any, I'll give you that my personal opinion, not the opinion of NCTA or NASTA's members' view on this thing. my other favorite comic artist, Bill Watterson. I find my life's a lot easier if I lower my expectations. Um, you know, the hopes for a huge Republican wave that would allow, stomping on the brakes and sort of a 180-degree turn from where things are going for the industry right now are probably unrealistic. I think maybe an interesting historical perspective, because I just can't stay away from them, is President Lyndon Baines Johnson. All right, President, and I love that picture right there. I did the research. The term to buttonhole somebody goes way back to the early 1800s, but President Johnson was famous for this. A creature of the Senate. He literally would grab people by the lapel and pull them in close and not let them get away until he browbeating them into what he wanted. He rammed his Great Society programs through Congress during his first few years of in office. We're talking welfare, Medicaid, Medicare, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all of those things pushed through in the first couple of years. And what happened? The voters punished the Democrats at the polls in the 1966 midterms. At that one, the Republicans picked up 47 seats that year, and 2 years later, mired in Vietnam, President Johnson announced that he would not seek another term. Your famous speech: "If nominated, I will not accept. If elected, I will not serve." President Johnson's average approval rating was 74% when he came into office. It just President Biden's never been anywhere near that, but shrank to President Biden's current levels as the war dragged on. Again, practical effects of all of these things on the politics. There will be practical effects with it. I think everyone's still pretty confident that the House is still going to flip to Republican control. The question is just how big a margin is it? House Republicans are already busily planning the investigations they're going to launch once they're in charge. And the divided Congress can help slow that EPA regulatory train we described a minute ago through increased oversight activities and those sorts of things. On the Senate side, again, I think at this point it's a toss-up whether that change in control happens. And if it does happen, it's likely to be narrow. As the Trump administration showed, one of the greatest benefits of the Republicans taking back control of the Senate would be the opportunity to confirm judges, which feeds into the next conclusion, which is that regulations are hard. They take a long time to develop, and they're really not done until the inevitable litigation that follows every final rule plays itself out. So winning back the Senate, if they can do it, is a big deal for the Democrats, because it's that judiciary that is in those judges who are increasingly going to determine which of these regulations stick for long term and which regulations don't. One more caveat, however, as we saw, that Supreme Court decision overturned previous PA greenhouse gas regulations, but you know what? The cake was already baked on the trajectory of a lot of the coal plant closures, and as the very recently passed Inflation Reduction Act graphically exposed, there's an already established disconnect between coal producers and their utility customers. The coal producers were adamantly opposed to the Inflation Reduction Act. Utility customers were pretty darn supportive of it, because what it did for extending renewables tax credits and so forth, and again, there a lot of these companies have already made the decision to get out of coal. Those decisions are being moderated now. Some of these plants are going to run longer than intended, but to expect that segment of the industry to turn on a dime and go back to reinvest in rebuilding coal in this country is probably not a realistic expectation. So my last slide, how's it going to go in the election? I think one of the smartest political observers ever was the guy who got Bill Clinton elected the first time in 1992, when he had plastered in every campaign office across the country a banner that said, "It's the economy, stupid." And that calculus still very much holds true. Who says you can't find a dollar slice in this city? I was in an airplane 2 days ago, and I selected the Sun chips for my treat sitting back in coach, and they handed me the cutest little bag that had exactly 3 Sun chips in it. Inflation is taking a bite. People are feeling it in their pocketbooks. They're not satisfied. They're mad, and I think they are going to take out some of that frustration in the polls in November. The question is, how many of them are going to turn out, and how wide is that margin of victory going to be? So there's my qualifications for what they are, but I'll put it back on a funnier looking slide and open it up for questions here. Please, you're welcome to use the chat box to type any questions or unmute yourself and ask away. If we get it done here with no questions, we'll be finishing in exactly 4 minutes short of an hour, which I'm not sure I've ever been able to accomplish before. So we appreciate everybody's cooperation there. Any questions at all on the where the election's headed, or the conclusions we've drawn about what to expect for our industry? What about gubernatorial races and energy policy? Great question from Steve Hooks. We could do a whole presentation on what's happening in the states. There are a couple of bellwether Republican versus Democratic contexts out there, but for the most part, the Republicans are retaining the upper hand in the state houses. There's some great graphs out there that show a number of states have veto-proof majorities with Republicans now, and the picture is much brighter. Continues to be bright for the Republicans of the state houses. The problem is many of the energy policies that affect what we do in our industry are determined at that federal level. So while the states can be helpful, the bigger picture macro issues, I'm afraid, fall with Congress and the president. Question, will the presentation be available to all participants? The answer is yes. You can get in touch with the lovely and talented Melinda Cantor, Melinda, MELINDA at movecoal.org. She can also answer any follow-up questions for you. This presentation has also been recorded. So we can make a recording link available if you've got colleagues or others who may be interested in listening to all the sarcastic commentary that goes in addition to the slides. So question from Emily, what do you think Trump's chances are for getting the nomination for the White House in 2024? Boy, I wouldn't even hazard a guess. The question presupposes that Trump is going to run again, and I think that's probably a pretty good presumption. I think announcements have been held off because any announcement by President Trump before the November elections would further galvanize the loyal opposition who is trying. There's a big split in the Democratic Party right now as to whether this election should be about Trump. There's a lot of Democrats that want to run on Trump's administration, but other Democrats saying, no, it's the economy, stupid. But I will go out on a limb and say I think Trump will run again. With regard to his odds for getting the nomination, is so far in the future. I'm going to chicken out and not even hazard a guess at this point. Another question, any thoughts about how the election season will impact potential rail strike? Will Congress want to stay out of it? Oh, that's a great question. I love that question. Listen, it's no coincidence that the point at which a national rail strike could take place beginning in the middle of September is happening right before the election. Just 30,000 foot view on what's got us to where we are on the rail strike. I mean, labor negotiations between the major Class 1 railroads and the whole bunches of unions that are involved here have been going on for almost 3 years now. They had already gone, and there's a very prescribed process that they have to move through. And it went to moving through that prescribed process, they went to the National Mediation Board, which of course is Democrat controlled now. And the National Mediation Board didn't spend a lot of time with it before they washed their hands and said, nope, time to move on to the next step. And they did it. They took that step in June, which is what put it on the glide path to mid-September, which is where we are now. You know, when the National Mediation Board washed their hands of it, it triggered a 30-day cooling off period. That allowed, the next step was the president appointed a presidential emergency board, a PEB, which had 30 days to come up with proposals. They did that. Those were announced a week or two ago. You know, so they proposed settlement terms. We're now in another 30-day cooling off period, which means September 16th, if the railroads and labor unions don't settle between now and then, the railroads would have this right to strike, or conversely, the labor would have the right to strike, or conversely, the railroads would have the ability to lock labor out. What happened the last time this happened in 1992 is one of the rail labor unions struck, and then the railroads locked the rest of the unions out. And at that point, it is up to Congress, and Congress can step in. There's a whole bunch of things to do. They can issue a back to work order. They can impose binding arbitration. They can impose their own deal. But that's why this is an excellent question. You know, you look at the rail analysts who are a lot smarter than me. You've got guys like Tony Hatch who say, guys, stop talking about a rail strike. A rail strike's not going to happen. You know, if it does, it's going to be a super short one like it was in 1992, which was the last time the whole system is set up to prevent it. But then you got other analysts on the other side of the coin, guys like Frank Wilner, that say, no, you know, here's some conditions that are way different now. And if you're a labor union who just sat through the presentation we just gave about where politics is heading, you know, they're not going to get a better shot at anything out of the next Congress than they have with the one who's sitting now. And they may roll the dice and say, no, this is the best shot we're going to get. We're going to push it. You know, conversely, the railroads may be asking Congress to force things into binding arbitration, but you know, that may not happen either. And then, you know, back to my final point on the warning slide. When was the last time since COVID that things happened the way they're supposed to? So again, my crystal ball is pretty muddy there, but the experts, guys who are a lot smarter at this sort of thing than I am, are way on both sides of the fence as to whether a rail strike is a possibility. And by the way, if it happens, it doesn't necessarily have to happen on September 16th. Another question here from Jody. You mentioned the potential rail strike in mid-September. Has there been any beneficial discussion between the Presidential Emergency Board and the railroad industry to prevent the strike? The Presidential Emergency Board's recommendations came out. The labor was the first to react to them, and they did not react well. They said it's better than what the railroads have been offering us, but it's not enough. The railroads came out after that piecemeal and have sent signals that they sort of like the Presidential Emergency Board, or at least said we're going to be cooperative and sit with that. But I think there's a very real possibility that it's going to land back in Congress's lap around September 15th. And another point that Frank Wilner makes that's very good is that the strike doesn't necessarily have to happen that day. You know, even if there is a deal that's worked out, that deal has to go back for ratification by the labor membership in a whole bunch of different unions. And if even one of those unions, the labor membership says, nah, we're done. We're not going to do it. We're going to strike. You know, we could be back into that situation. So it doesn't have to happen in September. That's just the trigger point. It could happen later in the year, or it could happen early into next year, it's going to remain a dynamic situation for a good long time, though. So again, shameless self-promotion, a really good reason for you to come to Denver for our conference, which will be happening literally days before this trigger point. And we'll be having lots of good discussion on that possibility, in addition to, where regulations and markets are heading from there. So great questions. Appreciate all of those. Any other questions for unmute or put them in the chat box? All right. Well, I'm not seeing any. We went about 5 minutes over, but hopefully we'll be respectful of everybody else's time now and give it back to you again. The presentations will be available by contacting Melinda, or if you have other colleagues that you think would benefit, get in touch with us. We'll give you a link and they can review the broadcast and get all the snide commentary that comes with the slides. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We very much appreciate it, and we hope to see a lot of you face-to-face next month in Denver. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Great job.